The coffee had gone cold an hour ago, but Pedro Gonzalez kept his hands wrapped around the mug anyway. At 70 years old, he found himself craving warmth in places that never used to feel cold. The kitchen of his Denver farmhouse sat quiet around him, filled with the kind of silence that only exists when someone who used to fill the space is gone forever. 6 months. It had been 6 months since Letitia's stroke took her in the middle of the night, so suddenly that Pedro woke up reaching for a ghost. The doctor said she didn't suffer. Pedro wasn't sure if that made it better or worse. He stared at the burnt toast on his plate, too dark, too bitter, exactly how Letitia hated it. She used to swat his hand away from the toaster dial and remake his breakfast with a lecture about how he treated food like punishment. "Pedro," she'd say in that voice that mixed exasperation with love, "you don't have to suffer to prove you're tough." But Letitia wasn't here to remake the toast anymore. The morning sun was just starting to burn through the October frost on the windows when Pedro heard it, the mechanical click of his front door lock disengaging. Not the sound of a key turning, the sound of something overriding the mechanism. His body reacted before his mind caught up. 30 years as a federal prosecutor had wired certain instincts deep into his nervous system. He stood up fast, his chair scraping against the linoleum, his right shoulder immediately flaring with the familiar ache that had been his constant companion since the surgery 2 years ago. The front door burst open. 4 people stormed into his home like they owned it. 2 large men in white medical uniforms led the charge, their boots heavy and purposeful on the hardwood floor his grandfather had laid in 1952. Behind them came his son Raul, 38 years old and wearing a suit that probably cost more than Pedro's truck. And beside Raul, his daughter-in-law Bianca, hiding behind oversized sunglasses even though the morning was overcast. "What the hell?" Pedro started, but Raul cut him off. "Sit down, Pedro. Not dad, not father. Pedro." The name landed like a slap. "Raul, what are you doing? You can't just break into my house." "Your house?" Raul laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. He walked past Pedro like he was furniture, his expensive shoes clicking on the floor, and threw a thick stack of papers onto the kitchen table. The impact knocked over the cold coffee mug, sending a brown stain spreading across the wood like a wound. "That's where you're wrong." Pedro's hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a rage so sudden and complete it felt like fire in his chest. He looked at Bianca, searching her face for some explanation, some sign that this was a misunderstanding. But she wouldn't meet his eyes. She stared at the wall behind him, at the place where the paint was peeling near the ceiling, at anywhere but her father-in-law's face. "This is an emergency guardianship order," Raul said, his voice taking on the tone you'd use with a child throwing a tantrum. "Signed by a judge this morning. You're coming with us, Pedro. You're not safe here anymore." Pedro grabbed the papers with trembling fingers, his reading glasses perched on the kitchen counter just out of reach. The legal text blurred in front of him, but he caught key phrases. Mental incapacity, danger to self, immediate intervention required. "This is insane," Pedro breathed. "I just had my physical last month. I'm fine. Look at you," Raul interrupted, gesturing at Pedro like he was evidence in a trial. "Look at this place. You left the stove on last week. You got lost in the supermarket. Bianca, tell him." Bianca flinched but didn't speak. "You can't take care of yourself anymore, Pedro," Raul continued, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "We're doing this because we love you, because someone has to." Pedro's mind raced, flipping through decades of courtroom experience, searching for the trap, the angle, the lie hidden in the truth. The stove incident, that was a fabrication. He remembered it clearly. Raul and Bianca had visited for tea 3 weeks ago. When Pedro went to the bathroom, he'd returned to find Bianca standing by the stove, claiming she'd smelled gas. But Pedro had checked. The burner was barely on, just enough to create suspicion, not enough to be dangerous. The supermarket. Pedro's jaw tightened. He hadn't been lost. He'd been avoiding Bruno Castillo, a debt collector he'd spotted near the produce section. Bruno worked for people who didn't send letters. They sent messages in broken bones. And Bruno had been looking for Raul. Pedro had recognized the predatory way the man moved through the aisles, and he'd taken the long way around to the exit to avoid being seen, to avoid leading Bruno back to his son. He'd been protecting Raul. And now Raul was weaponizing it against him. "I want to call my lawyer," Pedro said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. He moved toward the landline phone mounted on the wall. One of the orderlies stepped in front of him, 6'4" and solid as a wall. The man didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Raul leaned in close, so close that Pedro could smell his expensive cologne, something sharp and chemical that Letitia would have hated. When Raul spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, meant only for Pedro's ears. "Stop fighting it, old man. This shithole you call home is sitting on land worth $2.5 million. My company needs a cash injection, and it needs it fast. So you're going to go to the nice facility, and we're going to sell this place before the bank takes everything I've built. It's already done, Pedro." The judge signed the order. "You've got no moves left." There it was. The truth, naked and ugly. Not concern, not love, money. "Get out of my house," Pedro said, his voice low and dangerous, the voice he used to use when mob enforcers tried to intimidate witnesses. "I know my rights. An emergency guardianship requires immediate danger, and there is none. I'll fight this. He lunged for the phone, his shoulders screaming in protest, but the bigger orderly grabbed his arm and twisted it behind his back with practiced efficiency. White-hot pain exploded through Pedro's rotator cuff, the old injury flaring like someone had shoved a hot poker into the joint. "No!" Pedro gasped, his face pressed against the wall, the cool plaster against his cheek. "You can't!" He felt the needle before he saw it. A sharp prick in the side of his neck just below his ear. Cold liquid entered his bloodstream like ice water in his veins. "Full dose," Raul said somewhere behind him. "We need him compliant for transport." Pedro's legs began to give out, his vision tunneling at the edges. The orderlies dragged him toward the door, his feet sliding uselessly across the floor he'd walked on for 40 years. And then he heard it. A sound that broke something inside him that even Raul's betrayal hadn't quite shattered. Buster barked. His old golden retriever, 14 years old and arthritic, had been sleeping by the stove. The commotion had woken him, and now he trotted over on stiff legs, his tail wagging in confusion, trying to understand why his master was on the floor. Raul didn't break stride. He kicked Buster hard in the ribs with his Italian leather shoe. The dog yelped, a sound of pure pain and confusion, and skidded across the linoleum into the cabinets with a sickening thud. Pedro tried to scream, tried to curse Raul, tried to tell him that he would pay for that nobody hurts an innocent creature in this house. But his tongue felt like it weighed 10 pounds, and the darkness was closing in fast. The last thing Pedro saw before unconsciousness took him was Raul straightening his tie, picking up Pedro's car keys from the hook by the door, and looking around the kitchen like a king surveying conquered territory. And the last thing Pedro felt, as the world faded to black, was a cold, clarifying rage. They thought they were taking a helpless old man to be warehoused and forgotten. They were wrong. They'd just declared war on the hammer. The vibration of the road humming through the gurney frame was what pulled Pedro back from the void. But he kept his eyes closed and his breathing shallow. The sedative they'd pumped into his neck was heavy, a thick fog trying to smother his consciousness. But his mind had always been a fortress that refused to fall easily. It was a trick he'd learned from a witness protection officer back in '95. If they think you're still unconscious, they keep talking. And if they keep talking, they give you ammunition. The voices from the front of the ambulance drifted back to him through the chemical haze. "Honey, you need to stop crying." That was Raul, his voice tight with barely controlled irritation. "We did what we had to do. It's legal. It's done." "But he looked so scared, Raul." Bianca's voice was small, trembling. "Did you see his eyes right before the injection? He looked at me like he hated me." Pedro's unconscious fingers twitched slightly. "You made your choice, Bianca. You chose him." "He doesn't have the capacity to hate you, babe," Raul replied, and Pedro could practically hear the sneer in his voice. "His brain is mush. That's what the doctor's report says. He's confused, aggressive, living in filth. We're saving him from himself." Saving me. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so suffocating. Lying there in the dark, paralyzed by their drugs, Pedro felt memories flooding back, not of his retirement, not of the quiet farmer he'd become, but of another life. A life where he'd been someone else entirely. Thomas Pedro Gonzalez, federal prosecutor for the District of Colorado, 28 years in the trenches of the justice system, building RICO cases that dismantled criminal organizations brick by bloody brick. The mob had called him the Hammer because when he brought charges, he didn't just win, he obliterated. He'd put away murderers, racketeers, corrupt politicians. He'd stared down men who dissolved their enemies in acid, and he'd never blinked first. He'd retired at 60 to this farm, to Letitia, to peace. He'd traded his $3,000 suits for denim overalls. He'd traded federal courtrooms for rows of tomatoes. He'd chosen a quiet life, but he hadn't been forced into it. Raul seemed to have forgotten that history. Or maybe he'd just been too arrogant to believe the old man still had any fight left. Immediately after we drop him off, I'm heading back to the property with a locksmith, Raul continued, and Pedro's ears pricked up despite the fog. We need to change the locks before he tries to call anyone, not that he remembers any numbers anyway. The real estate agent's lined up for a walkthrough tomorrow morning. Tomorrow. They weren't wasting a single second. You're moving too fast, Bianca said, and there was something in her voice, doubt maybe, or guilt. We haven't even gone through Mom's things yet. Her clothes are still in the closet. We don't need to sort them, Rachel. We need to stage the house. Raul's patience was clearly running thin. Look, I spoke to the broker this morning. With the acreage and the barn, even in its current condition, the land is worth $2.5 million. Conservative estimate. If we find the right developer, maybe $3 million. $2.5 million. That was the price tag on 40 years of Pedro and Letitia's life together. That was the value Raul placed on the home where he'd grown up, where his mother had taught him to read, where Pedro had helped him with homework at that same kitchen table, now stained with spilled coffee. But what if he gets better? Bianca asked, her voice barely audible over the rumble of the engine. What if the doctors at the facility say he's fine? What if he wakes up and calls his old friends? He still knows people, Raul. Important people. Raul laughed, a cruel barking sound that made Pedro's blood run cold. Who's he going to call? Most of his old friends are dead or in nursing homes themselves. And even if he does, who are they going to believe? Me, the successful tech CEO with court orders and medical evaluations? Or a raving old lunatic who smells like chicken manure and thinks there's a conspiracy against him? Pedro's jaw would have clenched if he'd had control of his muscles. Chicken manure washes off, son, but the stench of greed is permanent. He's a has-been, Bianca. He's done. Nobody listens to old men who can't even keep their own kitchens clean. Raul's voice dropped lower, taking on a tone Pedro recognized from his prosecutor days, the voice of someone who thinks they've gotten away with something. Besides, after what happened to Vicente, I can't afford to wait. Silence fell in the ambulance. Even through his drugged haze, Pedro felt the weight of that statement. Vicente? Who the hell was Vicente? Raul, Bianca started, her voice sharp with warning. Forget I said that, Raul cut her off quickly. Just, we're doing this. It's happening. By this time next week, we'll have the cash, the creditors will be off my back, and we can start over. Clean slate. The ambulance began to slow, turning off smooth pavement onto gravel. The suspension creaked and Pedro felt the vehicle climbing a steep incline. They were close to wherever Raul was burying him. Through his barely cracked eyelids, Pedro caught a glimpse of the world outside, heavy iron gates sliding shut behind them, a tall fence, 12 feet at least, topped with decorative ironwork that was probably meant to look welcoming but served a more sinister purpose, keeping people in. The building ahead was modern, all glass and steel with a manicured lawn that looked too perfect to be real. A brass sign near the entrance read, Golden Horizon Senior Living. Senior Living. That's what they were calling prisons now. The ambulance stopped with a jerk. The back doors flew open, letting in a rush of cold October air and the smell of industrial disinfectant. 2 new orderlies appeared, their faces professional and indifferent, their hands rough as they grabbed the gurney and pulled Pedro out. As they wheeled him toward the entrance, Pedro saw Raul step out of the passenger seat. He was checking his reflection in the side mirror, adjusting his jacket like he'd just finished a successful business meeting. He looked like a man who'd closed a big deal. He didn't look at Pedro, didn't even glance at the father-in-law who'd once co-signed his first business loan. Raul only saw an obstacle that had finally been removed from his path. Bianca lingered by the car door, hugging herself against the chill. She stared at the building's cold facade, and for just a moment, Pedro thought he saw her lips move. "I'm sorry," she whispered. But sorry didn't unlock gates. Sorry didn't give him his life back. Pedro let his head loll to the side, maintaining the act. But inside, his mind was racing, cataloging every detail. The keypad on the main door, 6 digits, weathered keys on 1, 4, and 7. The location of security cameras, one at the entrance, one covering the parking lot, blind spot near the side exit. The shift change schedule visible on a clipboard near the reception desk. They wheeled him through automatic doors into a lobby that smelled of industrial cleaner, trying to mask something worse: urine, decay, despair. The reception desk was behind bulletproof glass. The nurses moved with the efficiency of prison guards processing a new inmate. "Welcome to Golden Horizons," a woman in a starched uniform said without smiling. Her name tag read, Brenda. "We'll take it from here." Raul handed over a thick file folder. Pedro's life, his rights, his freedom, all contained in a stack of papers built on lies. "Make sure he's comfortable," Raul said with a wink that made Pedro's stomach turn. "And by comfortable, I mean quiet. We don't want him agitating the other residents." "Understood, mister." "Gonzalez," Brenda replied. "We have a private room prepared, room 304. As they pushed Pedro down a long, fluorescent-lit corridor, away from the sunlight, away from his home, away from everything that made him human, Pedro made a promise to the memory of Leticia. "I'm not dying in this cage, mi amor. I'm coming back. And when I do, there will be a reckoning." Raul thought he'd buried a senile old farmer in a hole where no one would ever find him. He was wrong. He'd just planted a landmine, and the hammer was about to explode. Room 304 was a white box designed to erase identity. No clock on the wall to tell Pedro whether it was day or night. No window with a view of the mountains he'd spent 40 years watching. No photographs of Leticia. Just 4 white walls, a bed with safety rails like a crib, and the constant hum of fluorescent lights that buzzed like trapped flies. They'd taken everything. His wallet, his belt, even his wedding ring. The simple gold band Leticia had placed on his finger in 1975. Company policy, they'd said, to prevent theft or self-harm. But Pedro knew the truth. They were stripping away Thomas Pedro Gonzalez layer by layer until only a patient number remained. The staff treated him with the special condescension reserved for children and the dying. Nurse Brenda came twice a day with a small paper cup containing a blue pill that looked like candy but was designed to turn his sharp mind into oatmeal. The first time, Pedro refused. 2 orderlies held him down while Brenda forced it into his mouth, her thick fingers prying his jaw open. He'd learned his lesson quickly. On the second day, when Brenda appeared with her paper cup, Pedro let his jaw go slack. He stared at a spot on the wall, drooling slightly, letting his eyes go glassy and unfocused. "Good boy," Brenda said, placing the pill on his tongue. She handed him water and watched him swallow, her bored eyes barely registering the human being in front of her. Pedro gulped loudly, making a show of it, but the pill was tucked deep under his tongue, burning bitter against the soft tissue. The moment the door clicked shut, he stumbled to the toilet and spat the dissolving chemical into the water, flushing it away. It was risky. If they caught him, they'd switch to injections. But he needed his mind. His mind was the only weapon he had left. By the 3rd day, without the sedatives clouding his thoughts, the old instincts began to return. Pedro wasn't a prisoner. He was an undercover operative in hostile territory, and his mission was to find the cracks in their security. He spent hours in his wheelchair in the hallway, pretending to be catatonic. To the staff, he was just another piece of furniture, an old man waiting to die. But behind his glazed eyes, he was recording everything. The security camera above the nurse's station rotated on a 45-second loop. For 7 seconds every minute, the corner hallway leading to the fire exit was a blind spot. 7 seconds wasn't much time, but it might be enough. He watched the staff, profiling them like he used to profile suspects. Most were indifferent, just collecting paychecks. But there was one who stood out, the night orderly. His name tag said Jimmy Walker. Jimmy was young, maybe 23, with dark circles under his eyes that matched Pedro's. He smelled of stale tobacco and anxiety, and every night around 2 in the morning, when the floor was quiet, Jimmy would slip to the fire exit at the end of the hall, wedge a small piece of cardboard into the doorframe to prevent the latch from locking, and disappear outside for 5 minutes to smoke. He was bypassing the alarm system because he was too lazy to walk down to the designated smoking area on the 1st floor. It was a massive security breach. It was Pedro's ticket out, but he needed leverage. He had no money, no possessions to trade. The watch and wedding ring he'd planned to use were locked in a safe somewhere in the administrative office. Pedro watched Jimmy more closely. The young man spent his shifts on his phone, scrolling through banking apps and payment portals. Pedro heard him on hushed phone calls, arguing about being late on student loan payments. Jimmy was broke. Jimmy was desperate, and desperate men were negotiable. On the evening of the third day, Pedro's plan was interrupted by the smell of expensive cologne filling his sterile room. Raul. He walked in wearing casual clothes, a polo shirt and slacks that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. He carried a generic get-well-soon balloon that bobbed against the ceiling tiles. No flowers, no photos, just a balloon and a leather briefcase. "Hey, Pedro," Raul said, his voice loud and falsely cheerful. "You're looking good. Resting up, huh?" He closed the door behind him, and the smile dropped from his face instantly. He pulled the visitor chair close to the bed, invading Pedro's personal space. There was a sheen of sweat on Raul's upper lip, despite the room's meat locker temperature. His foot tapped nervously against the linoleum. Pedro stayed silent, maintaining his act. He stared past Raul, focusing on the white wall beyond his shoulder. "Cut the act, old man," Raul hissed, leaning in so close Pedro could count the pores on his nose. "I know you're in there. We need to talk business." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a document, thick, stapled, flagged with yellow sticky notes where signatures were required. "This is a durable power of attorney," Raul said, tapping the paper. "It gives me full control over your assets, your medical decisions, your estate. I need you to sign it, today." Pedro slowly turned his head to look at him. He let a little bit of the old Pedro surface, just enough to make Raul uncomfortable. "Why?" Pedro rasped, his voice gravelly from days of minimal use. "Because the real estate market is volatile," Raul said too quickly, his eyes darting to the door and back. "We have a cash buyer interested in the farm, a developer. They want to close next week, but they won't touch the deed unless I have clear authority to sell." Next week. The urgency told Pedro everything he needed to know. Land in that part of Denver didn't lose value in a week. If Raul was desperate to sell immediately, likely at a discount to a cash buyer, it meant he needed liquid capital now. Pedro looked at Raul's wrist. He was wearing a new watch, a Rolex Daytona. That was a $20,000 watch, and yet he was sweating about selling a $2.5 million farmhouse. The math didn't add up, unless the debt was massive, unless Raul was in a hole so deep that Pedro's farm was the only ladder out. "I'm not signing," Pedro said clearly and firmly. Raul's face turned blotchy red. He grabbed Pedro's arm, his fingers digging into the bruise the orderly had left 3 days ago. Pain shot through Pedro's shoulder, but he didn't flinch. "Listen to me, you stubborn fossil," Raul snarled. "You're never leaving this room. You're going to rot in here. But if you sign this, I can make your stay pleasant. Private room with a view, an iPad with Netflix. You can watch your westerns, better food. Just sign the damn paper." He was bribing him with an iPad, threatening him with oblivion, but what he was really doing was showing his hand. He was terrified. Pedro pulled his arm away from Raul's grip. "Get out," he said quietly. Raul stood up, knocking the chair over. "You're making a mistake, Pedro, a big mistake. I'm the only one who visits you. If you don't help me, I can't help you." He stormed out, leaving the papers on the bedside table, hoping Pedro would change his mind. But as the door slammed shut, Pedro didn't look at the papers. He looked at the space where Raul had been standing, analyzing every word, every gesture. Raul was in serious trouble. A man doesn't threaten his father-in-law over a real estate deal unless he has sharks circling. And the mention of Vicente, whoever that was, suggested the danger was even deeper than financial. Pedro looked at the clock through the open door. 7 p.m., shift change in an hour. Jimmy would be coming on duty. Tonight, Pedro was going to make a deal. Tonight, he was going to get out of this cage. And then he was going to find out exactly why his son was sweating through his expensive clothes. The clock inside Pedro's head ticked past 2 in the morning. The hallway outside room 304 was silent, except for the rhythmic humming of the industrial refrigerator and the occasional groan of a patient lost in nightmares. Pedro sat on the edge of his bed, his feet touching the cold linoleum. His shoulder throbbed with a dull, insistent ache, but adrenaline was a powerful painkiller. He checked the hallway through the crack in his door. Empty. The nurse at the station was engrossed in a celebrity magazine, her back to the corridor. This was it. Pedro moved with a stealth that surprised even himself, navigating the hallway like a ghost. He wasn't the shuffling, medicated zombie they wanted him to be. He was a man with purpose. He reached the fire exit at the end of the hall. Just as he'd observed for 3 nights, the heavy metal door was propped open a fraction of an inch by a small piece of folded cardboard. A thin stream of cold night air bled into the sterile warmth of the facility. Pedro pushed it open just enough to slip through. Jimmy was there, leaning against the brick wall, the orange cherry of his cigarette glowing in the darkness. He jumped when he saw Pedro, nearly dropping his smoke. "What the hell, Mr. Gonzalez?" Jimmy whispered, his voice cracking with panic. "You can't be out here. If the supervisor sees you, I'm dead. You have to go back to bed right now." Pedro didn't move. He stood his ground, letting the cold October air sharpen his senses. He looked Jimmy up and down, cheap sneakers worn through at the heels, a uniform that was slightly too big, the exhausted look of someone working double shifts just to stay afloat. "I need a favor, Jimmy," Pedro said, his voice low and steady, "and I'm willing to make it worth your while." Jimmy laughed, a nervous, jittery sound. "You don't have any money, old-timer. They took your wallet when you checked in. You don't even have a stick of gum. Go back inside before I call the nurse." Pedro had anticipated this. He'd spent 3 days thinking through every angle, every play. He had no money, no possessions to trade, but he had something more valuable. He had knowledge. "Jimmy," Pedro said, stepping closer, "I know you're skimming pills. Room 217's patient gets 3 sedatives per protocol, but you pocket 1 every shift and sell it. I can prove it. Or I can forget it." Jimmy's cigarette fell from his fingers. His face went pale in the moonlight. That's a lie. I used to prosecute pharmacy fraud cases, son," Pedro interrupted, his voice taking on the steel edge he'd used in federal courtrooms. "I know every trick. I know how you log the full dosage but split the pills. I know you sell them to Gerald Morrison, the veteran in room 118 who has chronic pain and a wife who can't afford his prescriptions." Jimmy's mouth opened and closed like a fish. "How do you—" "Because I'm not what your clipboard says I am," Pedro said. "I'm not senile. I'm not confused. I'm a retired federal prosecutor who spent 30 years putting criminals in prison, and right now, I need your help." He let that sink in for a moment, watching the fear and calculation war in Jimmy's eyes. "Get me a phone," Pedro continued. "A burner, prepaid, untraceable, and the staff Wi-Fi password. Do that and I'll teach you how to cover your tracks better. I'll show you how to log your inventory so auditors never catch the discrepancy. You can help Mr. Morrison without risking your job." Jimmy licked his lips, greed warring with fear. "And if I don't?" Pedro stepped even closer, invading his personal space. "Then tomorrow morning, when the shift supervisor comes in, I'm going to tell her everything. And Jimmy, I know how to build a narrative that sticks. Who are they going to believe? The confused old man, or the broke orderly who drives a 15-year-old Honda and owes $40,000 in student loans?" The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sound of traffic on the highway. "Fine," Jimmy finally spat out. "I have a spare phone in my car, an old Android. It has minutes on it." "Go get it," Pedro commanded. "And a charger. I'll wait here." Jimmy disappeared into the darkness of the parking lot. Pedro stood by the door, shivering, rubbing his arms against the cold. His shoulder was screaming now, the pain almost unbearable. But he'd endured worse. He'd endure anything to get out of this cage. 5 minutes later, Jimmy returned, breathless. He handed Pedro a cracked black smartphone and a tangled charging cord. He also handed him a slip of paper with a string of numbers scrawled on it. "There," Jimmy said. "That's the phone. Password's on the paper. Now we're even, and if anyone asks, you were never here," Pedro finished. "I stole this from a visitor. Understood?" Jimmy nodded, pale and shaking. "One more thing, Jimmy," Pedro said, stopping him before he could light another cigarette. "If you try to double-cross me to get a bonus from management, remember what I said. I might be in a bathrobe right now, but I still know judges. I still know cops. I can make your life very difficult from inside this room. Are we clear?" "Crystal," Jimmy whispered. Pedro slipped back inside, the door clicking softly behind him. He navigated the hallway like a ghost, his heart hammering against his ribs. He made it back to room 304 without seeing a soul. He crawled into bed and pulled the thin blanket over his head, creating a small private tent. The phone's screen lit up, casting a blue glow on his weathered face. Battery at 40%. It would be enough. He connected to the Wi-Fi using Jimmy's password. The signal was strong. His fingers trembled slightly as he opened the browser. He didn't go to news sites. He didn't check email. He went straight to the one place that held the truth about his life and his property, the county clerk's public records database. He'd built a career on following the money, and now he was going to follow his own. Pedro typed in his farm's address. The search results populated quickly. He scrolled past the deed history, past the tax assessments. He was looking for recent filings, anything that would explain why Raul was desperate to sell for $2.5 million. And then he saw it. A zoning variance application filed 3 weeks ago by the Colorado Public Utilities Commission. He clicked on the document, squinting at the small text on the cracked screen. Proposed subterranean aqueduct project. Eminent domain assessment pending. Pedro's pulse quickened. He opened the attached geological survey map. There it was, a massive blue vein running deep beneath the dry soil of the county, the Ogallala Aquifer extension. He kept reading, following the digital paper trail, a proposed extraction site, an acquisition proposal from a multinational beverage conglomerate called Pure Flow Holdings. They weren't just looking for water, they were looking for a regional bottling hub. Pedro scrolled down to the valuation assessment, his breath caught in his throat. The estimated value of the land with full water rights and mineral access was not $2.5 million. It was $12.4 million, with an additional perpetual royalty clause for every gallon pumped. $12 million. The number danced before Pedro's eyes in the dim blue light. This was generational wealth. This was the kind of money that changed lives, built legacies, funded scholarships in Letitia's name. And Raul was trying to sell it for $2.5 million next week. Why would he rush to sell for a fraction of the value when he could wait 6 months and get $12 million? Greed was usually patient when the payout was that big. Unless he couldn't wait. Unless he didn't have 6 months. Unless he didn't even have 6 weeks. Pedro closed the property records and opened a new search tab. He typed in Raul Gonzalez Neural Bridge lawsuit. The screen filled with red flags. Civil court dockets from Denver and Las Vegas. 3 lawsuits from angel investors alleging fraud and misappropriation of funds. Neural Bridge had been dissolved by the state for failure to pay taxes 6 months ago. But that was just the surface. Pedro found a judgment lien filed last week, not from a bank, from a private holding company with a name that sounded legitimate but smelled like a front for loan sharks. Cross Financial Services, LLC. The judgment was for $5.8 million, $5,800,000. Pedro sat back against his pillow, the pieces falling into place like evidence in a trial. Raul wasn't just broke, he was drowning. He owed money to people who didn't send collection letters. They sent men like Bruno Castillo with baseball bats. He needed fast cash to throw meat to the wolves and buy himself another month of breathing room. He was willing to burn $10 million of his own wife's inheritance just to save his own skin. But there was something else, something darker. Pedro scrolled through more court documents, and then he found it buried in the civil filings. A wrongful death lawsuit, filed 4 months ago by the family of Vicente Torres. Vicente Torres, 34, former business partner of Raul Gonzalez at Neural Bridge Technologies, found deceased in apparent robbery. Family alleges gross negligence and possible foul play. Pedro's hands went cold. Vicente, the name Raul had mentioned in the ambulance. After what happened to Vicente, I can't afford to wait. Pedro clicked on the case details. Vicente Torres had been scheduled to meet with SEC investigators 1 week before he died. He'd been preparing to testify about financial irregularities at Neural Bridge, fraud, embezzlement, false reports to investors, and then he'd been found dead in a parking garage, officially ruled a robbery. But the family's lawsuit alleged that the police investigation had been cursory, that evidence had been ignored. Pedro pulled up news articles. Security footage from the night Vicente died showed a vehicle following him into the parking garage. The footage was grainy, but the car matched the description of Raul's Tesla. Not proof, circumstantial at best, but combined with motive, with the timing, with Raul's desperate comment in the ambulance, Pedro's son hadn't just committed fraud. He might have committed murder, or at the very least he knew who had. Pedro turned off the phone and hid it inside his pillowcase. He lay back in the darkness, staring up at the ceiling he couldn't see. This wasn't just about saving his farm anymore. This was about stopping a man who had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed, a man who would do anything, anything to survive. And that man was his son. Pedro thought of Letitia, of what she would want him to do. He heard her voice in his memory. "You always taught Raul that actions have consequences, mi amor. Even yours do." He closed his eyes, and for the first time in 6 months, he felt something other than grief. He felt purpose. Tomorrow, he would escape. Tomorrow, he would find help, and tomorrow he would begin building the case that would either save his son's soul or destroy what was left of it. The hammer was awake, and justice was coming. Night 4. Pedro lay in bed, fully dressed under the thin blanket, waiting for 2 a.m. The phone was charged and hidden in his sock. He'd memorized Dr. Murray's address. The old medical examiner lived 2 miles away in a quiet suburban neighborhood. 2 miles. Pedro could walk that. He had to. At 1:55 a.m., he slipped out of room 304. The hallway was dark except for the green glow of exit signs. The nurse at the station had her headphones in, watching something on her phone. Pedro moved during the camera's blind spot, 7 seconds to reach the corner, then another 7 to make it to the fire exit. Jimmy was already there, smoking nervously. "You're really doing this?" Jimmy whispered, looking terrified. "Loading dock," Pedro said quietly. "Like we discussed, 10 minutes." Jimmy had agreed to help him exit through the service entrance during the shift change. It was cleaner than climbing fences, and Pedro's shoulder couldn't take that kind of stress. They moved through the service corridors, Jimmy leading, Pedro following. The loading dock was deserted at 2 a.m. Jimmy unlocked the roll-up door manually, lifting it just high enough for Pedro to slip under. "You got 10 minutes before security sweep," Jimmy hissed. "Don't make me regret this." "You're doing the right thing, son," Pedro said, and then he was outside, free. The October night hit him like a slap, cold, sharp, real. Rain had started to fall, a light drizzle that would turn into a storm by morning. Pedro pulled the thin jacket Jimmy had given him tighter and started walking. 2 miles. He'd walked marathons in his youth, but that was 50 years ago. Now every step was negotiation with his aging body. His shoulder throbbed, his knees complained. But rage was fuel, and Pedro had plenty of that. He stuck to side streets, avoiding main roads where a patrol car might spot an old man walking in the rain at 2:30 in the morning. The phone's GPS guided him through quiet neighborhoods where families slept, unaware that a ghost was passing by their windows. Mile 1 was adrenaline, mile 2 was pain. Around the 1.5-mile mark, Pedro had to stop. He sat on a bus bench, gasping, his shoulders screaming. The rain was coming down harder now, soaking through his jacket. He was 70 years old, exhausted, and for a moment he wondered if this was madness. Then he remembered Raul kicking Buster. He remembered the sound of his dog crying out in pain. He stood up. He kept walking. Dr. Robert Murray's ranch house appeared through the rain like a lighthouse. Pedro stumbled up the driveway, his legs barely holding him. He climbed the porch steps, each one feeling like a mountain, and knocked on the door. 3 hard raps. Lights flickered on inside. Footsteps. The door opened. Dr. Murray stood there in a plaid bathrobe, his white hair mussed from sleep, a baseball bat in his hand. He looked ready to defend his home from an intruder. Then he saw who was on his porch. "Dios mío," Murray breathed, dropping the bat. "Pedro?" Pedro tried to smile, but his face was too cold, too numb. "Hello, Robert," he rasped. "I need a doctor, and then I need to end this." Murray didn't hesitate. He pulled Pedro into the warmth of the hallway, shutting the storm out behind them. The hot shower nearly made Pedro weep. As the water washed away the mud and the institutional smell of golden horizons, he felt like he was washing away the victim and revealing the prosecutor underneath. Murray gave him dry clothes, flannel pajamas and a thick wool robe that smelled like cedar and old tobacco. They sat at Murray's kitchen table, Pedro's hands wrapped around a mug of hot soup, steam rising into his face like a blessing. Murray cleaned the cuts on Pedro's feet, wrapped his shoulder in a compression bandage, and shook his head. "You walked 2 miles in the rain with a torn rotator cuff. You're either the toughest man I know or the craziest." "Both," Pedro said, taking a sip of soup. "Robert, I need you to do a cognitive evaluation. On video, I need proof that my mind is sound. Murray studied his old friend's face. You're building a case. I'm building a war, Pedro corrected. Can you do it? Murray set up a camera on a tripod in his kitchen. For the next 40 minutes, he put Pedro through a battery of cognitive tests, mini mental state examination, logic puzzles, memory recall, advanced reasoning tests. Pedro didn't just pass, he excelled. But there were moments where the grief showed through. When Murray asked him to recall recent events, Pedro stumbled slightly, remembering the week Letitia died. His voice cracked. Your cognitive function is 95th percentile, Pedro, Murray said when they finished. But you're grieving. That's not dementia. That's being human. Pedro's composure finally broke. His shoulders shook. I miss her, Robert, every single day. Murray squeezed his friend's shoulder. Then honor her. Fight for what you built together. Pedro wiped his eyes, steadying himself. I need to make a call. He dialed a number he hadn't used in years but knew by heart. It rang twice. Miller Investigations. David, Pedro said. It's Gonzalez. I need you. There was a pause. Then, the hammer? Jesus, I thought you were dead, boss. I was, Pedro replied. But I'm back. And I need you to dig into someone, my son. I need everything. Financials, criminal background, associates. And David? I need it by tomorrow. I'm on my way, Miller said without hesitation. That was loyalty. Agent David Miller arrived at Murray's house 3 hours later with a mobile command center that looked like it belonged to the NSA. He was older than Pedro remembered, his hairline receding, his waistline expanding, but his eyes were still those hard, flinty stones that had stared down cartel bosses. Miller didn't waste time on pleasantries. He opened his laptop and started typing. Talk to me, boss. What am I looking for? Pedro laid out everything, the guardianship fraud, the $2.5 million sale, his suspicions about the land's true value. And then carefully, he mentioned Vicente Torres. Miller's fingers stopped moving on the keyboard. Vicente Torres, the neural bridge guy who died 4 months ago? You know about it? I know it was ruled a robbery, Miller said slowly. But the detective who caught the case? He closed it in 48 hours. No real investigation. The family tried to push for more, but they got stonewalled. Can you find out why? Miller's smile was wolfish. Already am. For the next 6 hours, while Pedro dozed fitfully on Murray's couch, Miller worked. When Pedro woke, Miller had compiled a digital dossier that would make the FBI jealous. Your son is drowning, boss, Miller said, turning the laptop around. Neuralbridge burned through $8 million in investor money, 3 fraud lawsuits pending. But the big one, Cross Financial Services, that's not a legitimate lending company, that's Vincent Cross. Pedro's blood went cold. He knew that name. Vincent Cross was a loan shark who'd operated in Denver for 20 years, always staying just one step ahead of RICO prosecution. Raul owes Cross $5.8 million, Miller continued, and Cross doesn't do payment plans, he does examples. Vicente, Pedro breathed. Miller pulled up police reports. Vicente Torres was going to testify to the SEC about Neuralbridge's fraud. He died 1 week before his scheduled testimony. Security footage shows a vehicle following him into the parking garage. Tesla Model S, dark blue. Raul drives a dark blue Tesla. I know, Miller said quietly. It's circumstantial, but combined with motive and opportunity. Pedro sat in silence, processing. His son, his boy, the child he'd taught to ride a bike, the teenager he'd protected from his own mistakes, might be a murderer. We need more, Pedro finally said. We need him on tape committing a crime we can prove. Way ahead of you, boss, Miller said, pulling up bank records. Raul has an appointment tomorrow at 2 p.m. at First National Bank. He's trying to wire funds from your equity line of credit. I've got a contact who can plant a listening device in the manager's office. Do it, Pedro ordered. And David, I need one more thing. Name it. My old trial suit, the charcoal 3-piece. It's at Giovanni's Tailoring on 16th Street. He's been storing it for me. Miller grinned. The power suit. I like it. The next afternoon, Pedro and Miller sat in an unmarked van across from First National Bank. Miller had planted the bug that morning. His contact was a janitor who owed him for making a DUI charge disappear years ago. At 2:15 p.m., Raoul's Porsche pulled into the parking lot. He parked in a handicap spot naturally. Miller handed Pedro headphones. "Showtime." They heard the office door open. A nervous voice. "Mr. Gonzalez, I wasn't expecting you without an appointment." "Cut the crap, Sterling," Raoul's voice came through, loud and agitated. "I don't have time for pleasantries. I need the transfer authorized. Now." "The emergency guardianship order," Sterling said carefully. "It's for medical decisions. Legal flagged it. We need conservatorship before we can release funds of this size." The sound of a fist hitting a desk made Pedro flinch. "The old man is a vegetable," Raoul screamed. "His brain is mush. I'm his guardian. That money is mine. I need it today." "I understand your position," Sterling stammered. "But if the old man wakes up—" "He's not going to wake up," Raoul snarled. "He's locked away in Golden Horizons on enough drugs to put down a horse. I made sure of it. He doesn't know what day it is. He's gone, Sterling. He's a ghost, and ghosts don't sue banks." Pedro's hands tightened into fists. There was a pause, then the sound of a zipper. "Look," Raoul's voice became smooth, seductive. "I brought this for your trouble. 10,000 cash, and when the property sells next week, I'll move the entire 12 million deposit into this branch. Think about your bonus, Sterling. Think about regional manager by Christmas." 12 million. So Raoul knew about the water rights. "The signature?" Sterling asked weakly. "Already done. I signed it this morning. His hand is shaky, Parkinson's or something. But it's his signature." It was a lie, a provable, prosecutable lie. "Okay," Sterling said, greed winning. 500,000, wire transfer to where? This account number, Nevada Holding Company, Cross Financial. Raoul was paying off the loan shark first. Miller was recording everything, logging timestamps. Pedro sat there, listening to his son confess to bank fraud, elder abuse, and forgery. When Raoul walked out of the bank 20 minutes later, he stood on the sidewalk, took a deep breath, and smiled. The smile of a man who thought he'd gotten away with murder. Pedro took off the headphones. "Do we have enough?" "Bank fraud, wire fraud, forgery, elder abuse," Miller listed. "And since the wire went to Nevada, we've got interstate commerce jurisdiction. This is federal, boss. This is 10 years minimum." Pedro looked at the bank, then down at his weathered hands. "Tomorrow morning, I walk into court, and I end this." That evening, at Giovanni's tailoring, Pedro put on his old suit. The charcoal three-piece was loose on his frame now. He'd lost weight since Letitia died, but Giovanni pinned it, adjusted it, made it fit like armor. Pedro looked at himself in the mirror. The old man with the sad eyes was gone. In his place stood the hammer. "One more battle," he whispered to his reflection. "For Letitia. For justice." The heavy oak doors of courtroom 4B swung open at 8:55 a.m., and Pedro stepped into the arena. He'd spent the night at Murray's house, preparing his case like he used to prepare for trial. Evidence organized, arguments rehearsed, witnesses lined up, the medical evaluation, the property records, the bank fraud recording, and the final ace up his sleeve, the document that would destroy Raoul's entire plan. Pedro walked down the center aisle in his tailored charcoal suit, a blood-red power tie at his throat, his polished shoes clicking on the parquet floor. He carried his old leather briefcase, scarred from decades of use. At the plaintiff's table sat Raoul and Bianca with their attorney, Sterling Vance, a man who specialized in guardianship cases and had the reputation of a shark. Raoul saw Pedro and laughed. He leaned over to Bianca. "Look at him. He thinks it's 1995. That suit's older than my car." Bianca giggled nervously, but her laughter didn't reach her eyes. Sterling Vance looked up from his tablet, saw Pedro was alone, no counsel, no paralegal, and visibly relaxed. A pro se defendant was a lawyer's dream. They always made mistakes. Pedro ignored them. He walked to the defendant's table and began unpacking his briefcase with military precision. Medical evaluation in the center, USB drive with the bank fraud recording to the right, water rights documentation to the left, legal pad and gold fountain pen in front. "Look at him lining up his pencils," Raoul muttered, "like a kid playing lawyer." Pedro slowly turned his head and locked eyes with Raoul. He didn't speak. He simply stared. The look a predator gives prey right before the kill. Raoul's smile faltered. He looked away, suddenly uncomfortable. The bailiff stood. All rise. Department 4B is now in session, the Honorable Judge Anthony Russo presiding. At that name, Pedro allowed himself a small smile. Judge Russo swept into the room, a small man with white hair and eyes like steel. He climbed to the bench, arranged his files, and picked up the case docket. Case number 4922, Gonzalez versus Gonzalez, Russo read aloud. Petition for permanent conservatorship and... He stopped. His eyes had found the defendant's name on the page, Thomas Pedro Gonzalez. Russo looked up slowly, peering over his reading glasses. His eyes found Pedro at the defendant's table. His face went completely pale. His hand trembled as he gripped the edge of the bench. My God, he whispered, is that Counselor Gonzalez? 20 years ago, Anthony Russo had been a junior prosecutor in Pedro's office. Pedro had taught him everything, how to build RICO cases, how to flip witnesses, how to spot a liar at 100 paces. Russo had called Pedro the best prosecutor Colorado ever had, and now Russo was the judge. Your Honor, Pedro stood, buttoning his jacket. Thomas Pedro Gonzalez, appearing pro se for the defense. Raoul's face drained of color as he realized what was happening. Sterling Vance leaned over, whispering urgently, but it was too late. The student had become the judge, and the master was about to teach one final lesson. Mr. Vance, Russo said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. I suggest you make your opening statement quickly, because I have a feeling this case is not going to go the way you planned. The trial had begun, and the hammer was about to fall.